The small town of Pine Creek had always been quiet. Most folks knew each other by name, and gossip traveled faster than the internet. The old-timers gathered at Joe's diner every morning, drinking coffee and talking about the weather or complaining about their aching joints. Among them was Harold Thompson, a 72-year-old Vietnam veteran who rarely missed his morning routine. Harold lived alone in a modest one-story house at the edge of town. His wife had passed away 5 years ago, and since then, he'd kept to himself most days. His weathered hands told stories of hard work, and the slight limp in his walk reminded everyone of his sacrifice for the country. He didn't talk much about his time in Vietnam, but the faded photos on his living room wall and the carefully folded flag in a glass case spoke volumes. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning. Harold woke up earlier than usual, his arthritis bothering him more than normal. He decided to take his morning walk before heading to the diner. The crisp autumn air might do his joints some good. He put on his favorite cap, the one with "Vietnam Veteran" embroidered on it, grabbed his cane, and headed out. He was about half a mile from his house when he noticed some commotion near the old Wilson property, which had been abandoned for years. Curious, he walked closer. Several police cars were parked outside, their lights flashing. Harold stood at a distance, watching as officers moved around the property. One of the officers, a young man who couldn't have been more than 30, noticed Harold and approached him. "Sir, you need to move along," the officer said, his voice unnecessarily stern. "Just watching," Harold replied, leaning on his cane. "Something wrong at the old Wilson place?" The officer's stance stiffened. "This is an active investigation area. I said move along." Harold nodded and began to turn away when another officer joined them. This one was older, with a sergeant's badge and a scowl that seemed permanent. "What's the problem here?" the sergeant asked, looking at Harold with suspicion. "No problem," Harold said calmly. "I'm just heading back now." "Let me see some ID," the sergeant demanded. Harold furrowed his brow. "I'm just taking my morning walk. I live down the road." "ID, now." The sergeant's hand moved to rest on his holster. Harold slowly reached for his wallet, his arthritic fingers making the simple task difficult. "I'm a resident. Been here 40 years. "Speed it up, old man," the younger officer said, impatience clear in his voice. "We don't have all day." Harold finally pulled out his ID and handed it over. The sergeant examined it with exaggerated scrutiny. "Harold Thompson," he read aloud. "What's your business here, Thompson?" "Like I said, just walking. Saw the lights and got curious." The sergeant stepped closer, invading Harold's personal space. "You always go walking near crime scenes? Find that interesting, do you?" Harold stood his ground, though his heart was beating faster now. "I didn't know it was a crime scene. I'll be on my way." When Harold reached for his ID, the sergeant pulled it back. "Not so fast. How do we know you're not involved?" "Involved in what?" Harold asked, confusion and frustration mixing in his voice. "We've had reports of drug activity on this property," the younger officer said. "You seem awfully interested in what's going on here." Harold shook his head. "I'm 72 years old. I'm a Vietnam vet. I'm not involved in any drugs." "Veterans can be criminals too," the sergeant said with a smirk. "Turn around and put your hands against the car." Harold stood still, shocked. "You want to search me? For what?" "Do it now, or we'll have a problem," the sergeant barked, grabbing Harold's arm roughly. The sudden movement threw Harold off balance. His cane slipped, and he stumbled, falling hard on his hip. Pain shot through his body. Resisting arrest, the younger officer shouted, moving in quickly. "I'm not resisting," Harold gasped, the pain making it hard to speak. "I fell." Despite his protests, the officers roughly handcuffed him. The cold metal bit into his wrists, aggravating his arthritis. They pulled him to his feet with no gentleness, ignoring his winces of pain. "Please," Harold said, his dignity being stripped away along with his rights. "My hip. I need my cane." "Should have thought about that before you decided to interfere with police business," the sergeant said, pushing Harold toward the patrol car. Mrs. Gladys Winters, another early riser in the neighborhood, witnessed the scene from her porch across the street. Her hands trembled as she recorded the incident on her phone. She knew Harold, a kind man who always helped her carry her groceries despite his own difficulties walking. What she was seeing was wrong, plain and simple. As the officers forced Harold into the back of the patrol car, she heard him ask again for his medication, which was in his pocket. The request was ignored. What the officers didn't know, what no one in town really knew, was that Harold's son wasn't just any soldier. He was Commander Thomas Thompson, one of the most respected and feared Delta Force operators in the military. And within 24 hours, he would learn about what happened to his father in this small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. In the holding cell at the Pine Creek police station, Harold sat alone, his hip throbbing and his wrists raw from the tight handcuffs. They had finally uncuffed him, but the damage was done. No one had read him his rights. No one had told him what he was being charged with. And no one had given him his phone call. As the sun began to set, Harold closed his eyes and thought of his son. Thomas would know what to do. Thomas always knew what to do. Commander Thomas Thompson was halfway across the world and his phone rang. Dust covered his tactical gear, and fatigue weighed heavy on his shoulders after a 30-hour mission. His team had just returned to base, and all he wanted was a shower and 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep. The number wasn't one he recognized, but it had his hometown area code. "Thompson," he answered, his voice low and rough from exhaustion. "Tom? This is Gladys Winters. From Pine Creek. I'm a neighbor of your father's." Thomas straightened immediately, sleep forgotten. "Is my dad okay?" There was a pause on the line. "Well, that's why I'm calling. The police arrested him this morning. They were very rough with him, Tom. I recorded it on my phone. I've been trying to get information all day, but they won't tell me anything because I'm not family." Thomas's grip on the phone tightened. "Arrested? For what?" "That's just it. I don't think they had any reason. He was just taking his morning walk and stopped to see what all the police cars were doing at the old Wilson place. Next thing I know, they've got him in handcuffs, and he fell. They didn't even help him up properly." Thomas was already moving, gathering his essential belongings with one hand. "Send me the video, Mrs. Winters. And thank you for calling me." After watching the video 3 times, Thomas sat motionless, a dangerous calm settling over him. What he'd seen wasn't just unprofessional, it was cruel. His father, a decorated veteran who'd sacrificed so much for his country, treated like a criminal for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Thomas made 2 calls. The first was to his commanding officer, requesting emergency family leave. The second was to his longtime friend, Jack Reynolds, who had left the military to become a lawyer in their hometown. "I need you to get my father out tonight," Thomas said without preamble when Jack answered. "Tom? What's going on?" "Dad's been arrested. No charges, no phone call, no respect. I'm sending you a video. Get him out, Jack. I'm catching the next flight home." 18 hours later, Thomas's rental car pulled up to the Pine Creek police station. He'd changed from his military fatigues into civilian clothes, jeans, a simple black t-shirt, and a leather jacket. Nothing about his appearance screamed military except his posture and the calculated awareness in his eyes as he scanned his surroundings. Inside, he found Jack waiting in the lobby, looking grim. "Your timing's good," Jack said quietly. "They're processing his release now." What happened? Thomas asked, his voice controlled. Jack shook his head. They claim they suspected him of being a lookout for a drug operation. It's complete nonsense. They had no probable cause, no warrant, nothing. When I showed up last night and started asking questions, they suddenly couldn't find the paperwork for his arrest. Thomas nodded once. And his condition? He's hurting. His hip is badly bruised from the fall. His wrists are raw from the cuffs. And they denied him his arthritis medication for almost 12 hours. Something cold and dangerous flashed in Thomas's eyes, but his face remained impassive. Who were the officers involved? Sergeant Bill Haynes and Officer Ryan Peterson. Haynes has had complaints before. Nothing ever sticks because the chief is his brother-in-law. Before Thomas could respond, a door opened, and Harold appeared, leaning heavily on a borrowed cane. His face brightened when he saw his son. "Tommy," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "You didn't have to come all this way." Thomas crossed the room in 4 long strides and carefully embraced his father. "Yes, I did." The drive home was quiet. Harold seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the experience. When they reached his house, Thomas helped him inside and made sure he took his medication before settling him in his favorite armchair. "I'm fine, son," Harold insisted, though the grimace when he shifted his weight told a different story. "Just a little bruised, that's all." "What they did wasn't right, Dad," Thomas said, sitting across from him. "It wasn't legal, and it wasn't right." Harold sighed. "This town's changed, Tommy. Ever since Chief Richardson retired and that new fellow took over, it's different. Those young officers, they don't have any respect for anyone. Especially not old men like me." Thomas leaned forward. "Tell me everything that happened. From the beginning." As Harold recounted the events, Thomas listened without interrupting, his face revealing nothing of the fury building inside him. Only his hands, clasped tightly together, showed any tension. "And they never read you your rights?" he finally asked when Harold finished. "No. Never told me what I was being charged with either. Just locked me up and forgot about me until your friend showed up." Thomas nodded slowly. "Get some rest, Dad. I'll take care of dinner later." Once Harold had dozed off in his chair, Thomas stepped outside onto the porch and made a series of calls. The first was to Mrs. Winters, thanking her and asking if she'd be willing to provide her video to a lawyer and potentially testify if needed. The second was to Jack, discussing legal options. The third was to someone he hadn't spoken to in years, his former Delta Force teammate who now worked for the state's Attorney General's office. As night fell over Pine Creek, Thomas sat on the porch, watching the street with the patience of a predator. This wasn't a war zone, and the police officers weren't enemy combatants. But Thomas Thompson hadn't become one of the most effective Delta Force commanders by acting rashly or without a plan. Justice for his father would come. And it would be by the book. But it would also be complete. Morning came to Pine Creek with a gentle rain that turned the world gray and soft. Thomas was already awake, having slept only a few hours on his father's couch. He'd spent most of the night making calls, reviewing local laws, and formulating a strategy. By dawn, he had a clear picture of what he was dealing with and how to proceed. Harold moved slowly that morning, wincing as he lowered himself into a kitchen chair. Thomas noticed but said nothing, respecting his father's pride while silently adding each grimace to his mental ledger. "You don't need to hover, son," Harold said as Thomas set a cup of coffee in front of him. "I've been taking care of myself for years now." "I know, Dad," Thomas replied, sitting down across from him. "But I'm here now." Harold studied his son's face. "You've got that look. The one you had when Billy Thornton was bullying the Johnson boy and you decided to do something about it." Thomas's mouth quirked slightly. "I remember. Got a black eye for my trouble." But Billy never bothered anyone again, Harold pointed out. What are you planning, Tommy? Justice, Thomas said simply. Nothing more, nothing less. After breakfast, Thomas drove into town. His first stop was the county courthouse, where he filed a formal complaint about his father's treatment with the clerk's office. Next was the town newspaper, where he met with a reporter named Diane Chen, who had written several pieces questioning the police department's practices under the new chief. I've heard similar stories, she told him after he explained his father's situation. But no one's been willing to go on record. They're afraid of retaliation. I'm not afraid, Thomas said. And neither is my father. We have the video, medical reports of his injuries, and a witness. Diane leaned forward, interest sparking in her eyes. This could be the story that finally gets some attention on what's happening here. That's what I'm counting on, Thomas replied. His next stop was the mayor's office. Mayor Frank Wilson was a political animal who had been in office for nearly 20 years. Thomas knew the type, more concerned with appearances than substance, easily swayed by public opinion. Commander Thompson, the mayor said, all smiles and firm handshakes when Thomas was shown into his office. It's an honor to meet you. Your military service is a credit to our town. My father's service is what brought me here today, Thomas said, declining to sit. He was assaulted by your police officers yesterday. The mayor's smile faltered. Assaulted? I heard there was a minor incident, but... It wasn't minor, Thomas interrupted, placing Mrs. Winter's phone on the mayor's desk and playing the video. The mayor's face paled as he watched. I had no idea it was this serious. Now you do, Thomas said, pocketing the phone. I've filed a formal complaint and spoken with the local paper. I'm also in contact with the state attorney general's office about a potential civil rights investigation. That seems excessive for an unfortunate misunderstanding, the mayor stammered. Thomas leaned forward slightly. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was abuse of power. And it stops now. As Thomas left City Hall, he noticed a police cruiser parked across the street. Officer Ryan Peterson, the younger officer from the video, was watching him. Thomas met his gaze steadily until Peterson looked away and drove off. Back at Harold's house, Thomas found Jack waiting on the porch. How's he doing? Jack asked, nodding toward the house. Hurting more than he'll admit, Thomas replied. Did you get the paperwork filed? Jack handed him a folder. Restraining order against the department regarding your father, plus the civil suit paperwork. We're requesting access to body cam footage, though I suspect it's mysteriously disappeared by now. Wouldn't surprise me, Thomas agreed. But the video Mrs. Winters took is damning enough. Inside, they found Harold dozing in his chair. Thomas lowered his voice. What about the other cases you mentioned? Jack's expression grew serious. I've contacted 3 other victims of similar treatment by Haynes and Peterson. 2 agreed to come forward with their stories after I told them about your father's case. Good. The more evidence of a pattern, the better. That evening, the Pine Creek Gazette published an online article about Harold's case, complete with a still image from the video showing the officers manhandling him. The story quickly spread through the town's social media groups. Midway through dinner, someone knocked on the door. Thomas answered it to find a young patrol officer who looked distinctly uncomfortable. Commander Thompson? I'm Officer Dave Miller. I'm here to check on Mr. Thompson's welfare. Thomas raised an eyebrow. On whose orders? The chief's, Miller admitted. But honestly, sir, I wanted to come myself. I was off duty yesterday when it happened. Mr. Thompson has always been kind to me. My grandfather served in Vietnam too. Thomas studied the young man. Come in, Officer Miller. My father would probably like to see a friendly face from the department. To Thomas's surprise, Miller seemed genuinely distressed by what had happened to Harold. He apologized repeatedly, even though he hadn't been involved. "It's not right," Miller said, accepting a cup of coffee. "The department's changed since Chief Roberts took over. Haynes and his buddies act like they own the town. Why hasn't anyone spoken up?" Harold asked. Miller looked down. "Chief Roberts fires anyone who questions him. Or worse, assigns them to the worst shifts, the worst duties, until they quit. Half the experienced officers have left already." Thomas and Jack exchanged glances. This was valuable information. "Would you be willing to make a statement about the department's practices?" Jack asked carefully. Miller hesitated, then nodded slowly. "For Mr. Thompson?" "Yes. But I'd lose my job." "Maybe," Thomas said. "Or maybe you'd be part of building a better department." After Miller left, Thomas stepped outside to make one more call. His contact at the Attorney General's office had promising news. "We've had complaints about Pine Creek before," she told him. "Your father's case might be the tipping point we need to launch a full investigation." As Thomas hung up, he noticed another police cruiser driving slowly past the house. This time, it was Sergeant Haynes behind the wheel. The man had the audacity to smile at Thomas before driving away. Thomas watched the taillights disappear down the street. The first pieces of his plan were falling into place. Tomorrow would bring the next phase, and a lesson that Haynes and his cronies wouldn't soon forget. The next morning, Pine Creek woke to find the story of Harold Thompson's mistreatment on the front page of the Gazette. Diane Chen had done her job well, presenting the facts alongside quotes from community members who'd witnessed Sergeant Haynes and Officer Peterson's behavior toward other residents. Comments from legal experts highlighted the constitutional violations in Harold's detention. The story painted a clear picture of a department that had strayed far from its duty to protect and serve. Thomas was up early, reviewing the article over coffee when his phone rang. It was his contact from the Attorney General's office, Lisa Diaz. "Your timing is impeccable, Commander," she said without preamble. "We've been building a case against Pine Creek PD for months. Your father's incident, combined with the new witnesses coming forward, gives us what we need to move forward with a formal investigation." "How soon?" Thomas asked. "I'm driving down today with a team. We'll need statements from your father and the others. And that video is gold." Thomas hung up feeling a grim satisfaction. The wheels of justice were turning, but he knew from experience that bureaucracy moved slowly. His father needed more immediate relief from the harassment. He spent the morning helping Harold with physical therapy exercises the doctor had recommended for his injured hip. The older man didn't complain, but Thomas could see the pain etched in the lines around his eyes. "You know they're watching the house," Harold said as they finished the exercises. "Drove by 3 times this morning already." "I know," Thomas replied calmly. "Let them watch." Around noon, Thomas drove to Joe's Diner, where his father usually had his morning coffee. The place fell silent when he walked in, all eyes turning toward him. News traveled fast in small towns. Joe himself came out from behind the counter, wiping his hands on his apron. "Your dad doing okay, Tom? We've been worried." "He's tough," Thomas said. "But what happened to him wasn't right." An older woman at a nearby table spoke up. "They did the same to my grandson last month. Boy was just walking home from his night shift, and they stopped him, said he looked suspicious. 17 years old, and they had him face down on the pavement." Another customer nodded. "My brother got pulled over 4 times in 2 weeks. No reason given." Thomas listened as more stories poured out. This wasn't just about his father. The whole town was suffering under the weight of unchecked authority. "Folks are afraid to speak up," Joe explained quietly. Chief Roberts made it clear that complaints would have consequences. Not anymore, Thomas assured them. Change is coming. When Thomas returned to the house, he found a state attorney general's car already parked outside. Lisa Diaz was taking Harold's official statement, her recorder on the coffee table between them. She was younger than Thomas had expected, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Commander," she greeted him. "Your father has been extremely helpful." Thomas noticed his father looked tired but determined. "He's always done his duty," he said simply. Lisa nodded. "We'll be interviewing other victims this afternoon. By tomorrow, we should have enough to request a federal monitor for the department." After she left, Thomas helped Harold to his bedroom for a rest. The statement had taken more out of him than he would admit. "You've started something big, Tommy," Harold said as he settled into bed. "The whole town's talking." "It was always big, Dad. Just nobody wanted to face it before." That evening, Jack arrived with news. The chief called an emergency meeting with the mayor and town council. "Word is, they're in panic mode." Thomas nodded. "Good. What about Haynes and Peterson?" "Still on duty, believe it or not." The chief must think pulling them would look like an admission of guilt. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Thomas opened it to find Officer Miller standing there, looking nervous. "Commander, I thought you should know. Haynes is furious about the newspaper article. He's talking about filing harassment charges against you for interfering with police business. He and Peterson are on patrol tonight, and I overheard them saying they might stop by to check on the welfare of your father again." Thomas thanked Miller for the warning. After the young officer left, he made several calls, then walked through the house, checking windows and doors. "Expecting trouble?" Jack asked. "Always prepare for contingencies," Thomas replied. "It's what keeps my teams alive." Around 10 o'clock, a police cruiser pulled up outside. Thomas watched through the window as Haynes and Peterson got out, adjusting their belts with the swagger of men who believed their badges put them above accountability. "Stay with my father," Thomas told Jack, moving toward the door. Thomas stepped onto the porch before the officers reached it, closing the door behind him. He stood with his hands visible at his sides, his posture relaxed but alert. "Gentlemen," he said quietly. "Can I help you?" Haynes smirked. "Just checking on the welfare of our elderly citizens. Making sure Mr. Thompson hasn't fallen again." "My father is resting," Thomas replied evenly. "Doctor's orders after his injuries in police custody." Peterson stepped closer, hand resting on his holster. "You've been causing a lot of trouble in our town, Commander. Might be time for you to head back to wherever you came from." "This is my hometown," Thomas said. "And my father's home. He earned the right to live here in peace through his service to this country." "Service doesn't put you above the law," Haynes sneered. "No," Thomas agreed. "It doesn't. Not him, and not you." Something in Thomas's tone made both officers tense. For the first time, they seemed to truly register who they were dealing with. "Is there an official purpose to this visit?" Thomas asked. "Or are you here to intimidate a witness in an active Attorney General investigation?" Haynes blinked, clearly not expecting Thomas to be so direct. "We're just doing our job." "So am I," Thomas replied. He reached slowly into his pocket and held up his phone. "And you should know that everything since you pulled up has been recorded and is being live-streamed to several secure locations, including the Attorney General's office." The officers exchanged glances, their confidence visibly wavering. "You boys have a choice to make tonight," Thomas continued calmly. "And it will determine everything that happens next." Haynes took a half step back, his swagger faltering. The mention of live streaming had caught him off guard. Peterson looked to his superior for guidance, his hand still hovering near his weapon. "You're bluffing," Haynes finally said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. Thomas tilted his phone screen toward them, showing the active recording. I don't bluff. That's not how Delta Force operates. We plan, we execute, we succeed. A tense silence stretched between them. For the first time since this began, Thomas could see real fear in Haynes's eyes. The sergeant was finally realizing he wasn't dealing with an ordinary civilian. Now, Thomas continued, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of command, here's what's going to happen. You're going to get back in your car and drive away. You're not going to come near my father or this house again unless you have a legitimate warrant signed by a judge. And even then, I suggest you bring the judge with you. Peterson shifted uncomfortably. You can't tell us how to do our job. I'm not, Thomas replied evenly. I'm reminding you what your job actually is. To protect and serve the community. Not to harass an elderly veteran because your ego got bruised when someone questioned your authority. He took a single step forward, and both officers instinctively moved back. My father served this country with honor. He came home with pieces of shrapnel still in his leg that burn him every day. He watched friends die for the freedoms you're supposed to be upholding. And yesterday, you treated him worse than he was treated by the enemy in Vietnam. The porch light cast harsh shadows across Thomas's face, highlighting the steel in his eyes. He wasn't raising his voice or making threats, and somehow that made his words all the more powerful. The state attorney general is investigating. The newspaper is watching. Half the town is filming you right now from their windows. And tomorrow, a team from Internal Affairs will be here from the state capitol. Haynes's head jerked up at that last piece of information. Internal Affairs? The chief hasn't mentioned. Because the chief doesn't know yet, Thomas cut him off. The call is scheduled for 8 a.m. Which gives you exactly 10 hours to decide which side of this you want to be on when they start asking questions. He let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. Officers who cooperate with investigations tend to fare better than those who obstruct them. That's just a friendly observation from someone who's been on both sides of investigations. Peterson swallowed hard. His hand had moved away from his holster. We were just doing a welfare check, Haynes muttered, but the excuse sounded hollow even to his own ears. Then consider it done. My father is well, apart from the injuries sustained in your custody. Good night, officers. Thomas didn't move, didn't blink, didn't show any sign that he expected anything other than their immediate departure. It was a technique he'd used in standoffs around the world, projecting absolute certainty that his will would be done. After another moment of tense silence, Haynes turned and headed back to the cruiser, gesturing sharply for Peterson to follow. Thomas remained on the porch, watching as they drove away, taillights disappearing around the corner. Only then did he end the recording and send it to Lisa Diaz with a brief message, additional evidence of intimidation. When Thomas went back inside, he found Jack and Harold in the living room. His father looked at him questioningly. They won't be back tonight, Thomas said simply. Jack shook his head in amazement. I've never seen Haynes back down from anything. What exactly did you say to them? The truth, Thomas replied. Sometimes that's the most powerful weapon. Later that night, after Jack had gone home and Harold had finally fallen asleep, Thomas sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, reviewing the events of the day. His phone buzzed with a text from Officer Miller. Word spreading about what happened tonight. Some of us are meeting tomorrow to discuss going on record with Internal Affairs. Thank you for showing us it's possible to stand up to them. Thomas allowed himself a small smile. This was how change really happened, not through force, but by empowering others to find their courage. His phone rang again. It was Lisa Diaz. I got your video, she said. It's textbook intimidation of a witness. We're accelerating our timeline. The team will be there at 7 a.m., not 9. And we're bringing the FBI Civil Rights Division with us. That should make for an interesting morning, Thomas commented. There's something else, Lisa continued. We pulled records on Haynes and Peterson. Haynes has 3 excessive force complaints that were buried. Peterson was hired despite being rejected by 2 other departments for psychological concerns. The chief has been building his own private army, Thomas observed. Looks that way, Lisa agreed. But it ends tomorrow. After they hung up, Thomas leaned back in his chair, gazing up at the stars. His father had taught him long ago that true strength wasn't about domination but about standing up for what was right, especially when it was difficult. Dawn was just a few hours away. By this time tomorrow, the balance of power in Pine Creek would shift. Not through violence or intimidation, the very tactics he despised in Haynes and his cronies, but through the system working as it should. As a Delta Force commander, Thomas had learned that sometimes the most effective operations weren't the ones with the highest body count, but the ones where strategic pressure was applied at exactly the right point to cause a complete collapse of the enemy's position. Tomorrow would be one of those operations. Inside the house, Harold stirred in his sleep, his face peaceful for the first time since the arrest. Thomas watched him through the doorway, recommitting himself to the mission at hand. This wasn't just about teaching Haynes and Peterson a lesson. It was about restoring his father's dignity and ensuring no one else in Pine Creek would suffer the same abuse. Morning came with a soft drizzle that turned the streets of Pine Creek slick and gray. Thomas was already up, dressed, and waiting when the unmarked vehicles pulled up in front of Harold's house at exactly 7 a.m. Lisa Diaz stepped out of the first car, followed by 2 men in suits who carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of federal agents. Commander Thompson, Lisa greeted him. This is Special Agent Ramirez and Special Agent Carter from the FBI Civil Rights Division. Thomas shook their hands, noting their firm grips and direct gazes. These were serious people who understood the gravity of what was happening in Pine Creek. Your father up for another statement? Lisa asked. He's getting dressed, Thomas replied. Coffee's ready inside. As they settled in the living room, Harold made his way carefully down the hallway, moving better than he had the day before but still favoring his injured hip. Quite the commotion you've stirred up, Tommy, he said with a hint of pride in his voice. For the next hour, the agents reviewed Harold's original statement, asked clarifying questions, and explained the process that would unfold. They were particularly interested in the video from Mrs. Winters and the intimidation attempt from the previous night. We're heading to the police station next, Agent Ramirez explained. We have a warrant to seize all records, body camera footage, and communications related to your case and others with similar patterns. What about Haynes and Peterson? Thomas asked. Agent Carter's expression was grim. They'll be questioned separately. If they're smart, they'll cooperate. By 8:30 a.m., the team was preparing to leave when Thomas's phone rang. It was Jack. You need to turn on the local news, Jack said without preamble. Channel 7. Thomas turned on Harold's television and found the station. A reporter was standing in front of the Pine Creek police station, where several official vehicles were parked. What sources are calling a major corruption investigation, the reporter was saying. FBI agents and state officials arrived just moments ago with warrants. We've learned this follows multiple allegations of civil rights violations, including the recent case of Vietnam veteran Harold Thompson, who was allegedly mistreated during an arrest. The camera panned to show officers being escorted from the building, including Chief Roberts, whose face was flushed with anger. That's moving faster than expected, Lisa commented, watching the broadcast. Thomas nodded. Small towns. Word travels fast. As the morning progressed, Thomas received updates from various sources. Officer Miller texted that he and 4 other officers had given statements about the department's practices under Chief Roberts. Mrs. Winters called to say reporters had interviewed her about the video. Jack reported that 3 more victims had come forward with stories similar to Harold's. Around noon, the mayor called, his tone conciliatory and nervous. "Commander Thompson, I want to personally assure you that the town takes these allegations very seriously. We had no idea of the extent of the problem." "That's hard to believe, Mayor," Thomas replied coolly. "Given how many complaints were filed and ignored." The mayor cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Yes, well, the town council is calling an emergency meeting tonight. We'd like you and your father to attend, if he's feeling up to it." After hanging up, Thomas relayed the conversation to Harold, who snorted in disbelief. "Wilson's running scared," the older man said. "Election's coming up in 3 months, and he knows this could sink him." Thomas smiled slightly. "We'll go. It might be illuminating." That evening, the town council meeting was moved from its usual room to the high school gymnasium to accommodate the crowd. It seemed like half the town had turned out, filling the bleachers and spilling onto the gym floor. Thomas and Harold arrived early, taking seats in the front row that Jack had saved for them. The mayor looked nervous as he called the meeting to order, his usual confidence nowhere to be seen. Next to him, empty chairs marked the absence of Chief Roberts and the town's legal counsel. "As you all know," the mayor began, his voice echoing through the gym, "our community is facing serious allegations regarding the conduct of certain members of our police department. The town council wants to assure everyone that we are cooperating fully with state and federal investigators." A voice called out from the crowd, "Why didn't you do something sooner?" Another joined in, "My son was harassed 3 times last year, and you did nothing." The mayor raised his hands, trying to calm the growing murmurs. "Please, everyone. We understand your concerns. That's why we've taken immediate action. Chief Roberts has been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. Sergeant Haynes and Officer Peterson have been suspended without pay." "That's not enough," someone shouted. Thomas watched the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. The community was finding its voice. The mayor cleared his throat again. "Additionally, we've unanimously voted to appoint Lieutenant David Wilson as acting chief. He's a 20-year veteran of the force who's been stationed in our neighboring county for the past 5 years. A tall, serious-looking man in uniform stood up from the audience. "I grew up in Pine Creek," he said in a deep, steady voice. "My first priority will be a complete review of all department policies and practices. My second will be to meet with community members who've had negative experiences with our officers. I want to hear from all of you." The crowd's response was cautiously hopeful. Thomas recognized the man's name. He had a solid reputation and had left Pine Creek PD years ago rather than compromise his principles under the previous leadership. As the meeting continued, Harold leaned over to Thomas. "You did this," he said quietly. "All these people finding their courage, it's because of you." Thomas shook his head. "No, Dad. It's because of you. You were the first one brave enough to stand up. I just helped amplify your voice." Across the gymnasium, Thomas caught Diane Chen's eye. The reporter gave him a subtle nod of respect. Next to her, Lisa Diaz was taking notes, her expression satisfied. The wheels of justice were turning at last. But Thomas knew the most critical part of his mission was still to come. 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. The investigation expanded beyond Pine Creek, uncovering a network of corruption that stretched to neighboring departments. Chief Roberts, Sergeant Haynes, and Officer Peterson weren't just bullies with badges, they were involved in protecting certain drug operations while targeting innocent citizens as diversions. Each day brought new revelations. Evidence surfaced that Roberts had been systematically hiring officers rejected by other departments for concerning behavior. Body camera footage that had supposedly been lost was recovered from hidden backups, revealing dozens of instances of excessive force and constitutional violations. Through it all, Thomas remained in Pine Creek, helping his father recover and assisting the investigation with his unique perspective on security protocols and chain of command failures. On a crisp Thursday morning, Thomas accompanied Harold to the courthouse, where Haynes and Peterson were being arraigned on multiple charges including official oppression, tampering with evidence, and civil rights violations. Chief Roberts had already been arrested on more serious charges of corruption and evidence tampering. Harold insisted on attending despite his still healing hip. "I want them to see me," he explained. "I want them to know I'm not afraid." The courtroom was packed with Pine Creek residents, many of whom had come forward with their own stories once the dam of silence had broken. Mrs. Winters sat with them, her phone, now famous for its damning video, tucked securely in her purse. When Haynes and Peterson were led in, handcuffed and wearing orange jumpsuits, a hush fell over the room. The men who had once strutted through town with such arrogance now kept their eyes down, shoulders hunched in defeat. As the charges were read, Thomas watched them carefully. Peterson looked genuinely shocked by the extent of what had been uncovered, suggesting he might have been a follower rather than an architect of the corruption. Haynes, however, showed no remorse, only anger at being caught. After the hearing, reporters clustered outside the courthouse. Diane Chen pushed through to reach Thomas and Harold. "Mr. Thompson, would you care to comment on today's proceedings?" Harold straightened to his full height, standing without his cane for the first time since his arrest. "Justice doesn't always come quickly, but it does come. My generation learned that in Vietnam, and it's still true today." Thomas stood silently beside his father, allowing him this moment. Harold had earned it. That evening, Acting Chief Wilson visited Harold's house, bringing with him a formal letter of apology from the town council and police department. More importantly, he brought news. "The State Police Academy has asked me to develop a new training module," Wilson explained as they sat in Harold's living room. "It's about constitutional rights and proper treatment of veterans and elderly citizens during police encounters. They'd like you to be involved, Mr. Thompson, to share your experience with the cadets." Harold looked surprised. "Me? I'm just an old man who got roughed up." Wilson shook his head. "You're the catalyst that exposed corruption and changed an entire department. Your story matters." After Wilson left, Thomas found his father on the porch, looking thoughtful as he watched the sunset. "Penny for your thoughts?" Thomas asked, settling into the chair beside him. "Just thinking about how things turn out," Harold replied. "When those officers pushed me down, I felt so powerless. Like nothing I'd ever done mattered." He looked at his son. "Now they're telling me my story could help train police across the state. Funny how life works." Thomas nodded. "The best lessons often come from the hardest experiences." "How much longer can you stay?" Harold asked after a moment. "My leave ends next week," Thomas admitted. "But Jack will be checking in on you, and so will Mrs. Winters. And Officer Miller promised to drive you to your physical therapy appointments." Harold chuckled. "I've got half the town looking after me now. I'll be fine, son." A week later, Thomas's rental car was packed and ready for the drive to the airport. The morning paper sat on the passenger seat, its headline announcing formal indictments against Roberts, Haynes, and Peterson, along with 2 county officials who had helped cover up their misconduct. As Thomas prepared to say goodbye, Harold handed him an envelope. "What's this?" Thomas asked. "Letters," Harold explained. "From people in town. They wanted to thank you." Thomas tucked the envelope into his jacket. "I didn't do this for thanks." "I know," Harold said. "You did it because it was right. That's how I raised you." They embraced, and Thomas felt his father's strength returning, not just physically, but in spirit. "You know," Harold said as they separated, "when people asked what you did for a living, I never could tell them much because of all that classified business. But I always told them you protected people who couldn't protect themselves." Now I've seen it firsthand. As Thomas drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Harold stood tall on his porch, no cane in sight, raising his hand in farewell. Around him, Pine Creek looked somehow brighter, as if a shadow had been lifted from the town. Thomas thought about the mission he'd undertaken here. Unlike his operations with Delta Force, there had been no firefights, no dramatic rescues. Just the steady application of pressure at the right points, exposing corruption to the light of day and allowing justice to take its course. It was, perhaps, the most important mission of his career. At a stoplight, Thomas opened the envelope his father had given him. Dozens of letters spilled out, some on proper stationery, others on notebook paper or the backs of receipts. He picked one at random and began to read. Dear Commander Thompson, my name is Layla Johnson. I'm 16 years old. Last year, Officers Haynes and Peterson stopped my brother for no reason and roughed him up. When we tried to complain, nobody listened. After what you did for your father, my brother found the courage to tell his story too. Yesterday, he got an official apology from Acting Chief Wilson. Thank you for showing us that one person really can make a difference. Thomas carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope with the others. The light turned green, and he continued toward the airport, knowing that sometimes the greatest victories were the quietest ones, not measured in battles won, but in lives changed and justice restored.